The speakers have kindly agreed to stay on to answer some questions in a Q&A session that we estimate will run about half an hour. Dale Ibsen, one of the technical people, has agreed to moderate the questions. There are two ways that you can ask your questions today. The preference is that you would actually type the question in the chat box. If you're not familiar with that, if you move your mouse along the screen, you should be able to see a chat bubble. You can click on that and it will pop open the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can just click on the blue bubble that says everyone so that everyone can see your question. And Dale will moderate the asking of questions to the speakers. If you have difficulty in operating the chat box, then find the icon on your screen that says to raise your hand, and Dale can call on you individually and ask you to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question.
Okay, I'm gone back into gallery view so I can see everyone. It's about 34 people still on the call, so give me your questions. Type them if you can, or raise your hand and I'll ask you, or even just speak them out. I'm okay if you just speak out your question. So unmute yourself before you do speak out your question, and I will try to type your question into the group chat so that Salima and Ingrid can see that. Well, one of the questions that we originally put into the group, into the questions for the groups was what to do about suicide. It's becoming so much we encounter that. If we have a suspicion that someone is suicidal, they've just given up, or they say that themselves, Salima, Ingrid, what do you recommend that we're not trained as psychiatrists or psychologists, of course, but we're the frontline people that often see that happening, and what can we do? What would you recommend to do in that kind of situation, and what kind of resources are available to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously suicide is a really challenging space to be in, obviously for the person, but also for someone who's worried about someone in their lives. The thing that I most often recommend is two things. So one, actually ask the question. There is this sense for some reason that people have that we shouldn't ask, that if you ask people if they're feeling suicidal, if you ask direct questions, it's somehow that will make them think about it more, or it will make them want to do it. And that's actually, the evidence doesn't support that. All the research tells us that our best option is to ask them directly. Hey, I noticed that you seem to be feeling kind of low. You know, are you thinking about ending your life? What is that like for you? What does that mean for you? And then based on that, try and connect them with resources that they need. So hopefully you all will get a list of resources that I've compiled just as basics. But also, the other thing is to always start with empathy. So empathy is trying to understand how someone else is feeling. And we can convey that in lots of different ways. But the thing that I usually recommend is, when I was training to become a therapist in our practicum, we were only allowed to do three things. When we were doing our peer counseling sessions, basically as practice work, we were allowed to ask questions only for factual information and clarification. But otherwise, the only things that we were allowed to say was reframing, rephrasing, reflecting. So what I hear you saying is, and empathy. And our prof had given us a formulaic empathy. So what I hear is that you feel, insert feeling, because, insert reason. So when we convey empathy, we want the person to hear that we understand both the feeling and why they feel that way. I hear that you're feeling hopeless because it feels like there's no end in sight to this pandemic. That would be a statement of empathy. So that's the other place that I think is a really good place to start with everything. Any conversation about really anything personal. Empathy is a good groundwork. And then, yeah, like I think ask the questions up front, because I think that's really, really important. And it allows us to get people in touch with the kinds of resources that they need. And then also just remember that, like, as folks who are trained in spiritual care, even though we can talk about suicide and life and death in sort of these very good theological, faithful ways, we are not counselors and we are not psychotherapists. And even for me as a psychotherapist, I'm not a psychiatrist, right? Like I can't, we all have limits to our expertise, and it takes all of us to do good work. And so we should refer, and we should and we can refer to people that are going to be able to pick up the pieces that we can't do.
Okay. Anything to add, Ingrid?
I just would like to add, when in a situation you are told that somebody is suicidal, and you feel and you sense that every conversation might not help, don't hesitate to call 911. It's because that means being taken seriously, the one who talks to you in ways that frightens you. So in terms of feeling the fear of the other person who sits in front of you, in terms of taking seriously what he says, in terms of not be afraid to step out of your role as counselor or psychiatrist, don't hesitate to take the next step if you think it's needed. And this is called 911.
I have a question about the whole notion of isolating in long-term care facilities.
Yeah.
And the very deep isolation that go happening there, and how that's affecting people's meaning of life and willingness to continue living. Could either one of you comment on that, how to deal with that from a mental health perspective? How can we help those dear beloved people in our families who are in those kind of situations when the isolation is so profound?
Vicky, thank you for this question. When I thought about boosting resilience in digital age, I thought about those who are not able to use the internet, those who don't have the abilities to use the internet, and so lose every and each contact to the outside. As somebody who has many people living in senior homes, I try to contact by writing, sending cards, by phoning, by letting them know that they are not alone, by trying to build an intentional community about this special person. So asking others, friends, parishioners, family members to continue to write cards, to phone, to send flowers. And it's even helpful, right now I think you can't enter senior homes anymore, but it's helpful just to have contact over the fence, or now between sitting with a class in between of you. So the most important thing is to let the other person know he or she is not forgotten. And sometimes a nice greeting card and some flowers does wonders. But I think it's a huge problem. You're so right, Vicky.
Yeah,
Vicky.
Sorry, can I just add? I just wanted to agree with all of that and just echo it, but also that, like, I think when we find folks are very isolated, even in care home settings, it's often a result of a failure of community care. So folks who don't have a community to rely on, people who don't have immediate family that's checking in, those are the cases where we see like really high levels of isolation. And so one of the things that I think is really important for all of us, particularly coming from faith communities, is to expand the reach of our circles to include more people. And so that means including lots of seniors and elderly folks who are in our communities who might not have close family nearby, who nobody else is checking in on. And I think even for people who are in our immediate families, it's easy for us to forget how hard it is and how big a difference it can make just to have a point of contact. So, for example, earlier on in the pandemic, one of my husband's grandmothers had been in a care home that was on lockdown. And we actually drove up and literally just like waved at her through the window, and the nurse had put the phone up for her. And so she could watch the kids playing and that kind of thing. And that was, it was magical. It was a wonderful thing. And I think we underestimate how much value there is in just including them in even just daily moments like that, where the kids were playing outside and she could watch them. And so some of it is also about just being really creative in moments like this about how we continue to include folks and what that can look like. And interestingly, so that grandmother of my husband's passed away just a couple weeks later. And it was just, it felt like it had been the right moment that we had made that effort to go. She actually, and they were in Calgary, so we made a drive specifically just to wave at the grandmothers through the window. And so a lot of it is also about remembering that putting in our time and energy is a valuable and worthwhile thing. Even though it might not seem like a lot, even though driving for 3 hours for a 5-minute chat seems like a lot, but in the end, it really isn't, because that can make the difference. So yeah.
Okay, another question?
There was a question quite early on. I would like to read it. It's not mine, but it says, Salima, you said that healing is messy and doesn't have a timeline. Suggestions for what we do while we wait. That one is from Anka.
Yeah, that one was actually, it was in Ingrid's talk, but since it was directed to me, I'll answer it, then I'll pass it over to Reverend Ingrid. Yeah, healing is not linear at all. And it is very messy. But I think it's not so much about waiting as recognizing that healing happens all the time. Even when it isn't a straightforward path, even when it feels a bit backwards, that's still healing. So for example, one of the things that I see very often, because I work a lot with trauma, is that folks will sort of get over like, it's like uncorking a bottle and all of this stuff comes out and we work through all of that. And then there's like this period of calm, and then all of a sudden other stuff will bubble up. And often my clients will say, I feel like I'm going backwards. It's actually not that you're going backwards. It's that your brain has decided that you're healed enough that you can handle more. That's what resilience is. That your brain says, hey, you have the resources now to be able to manage this. And so sometimes it's also about framing how we think about healing. Like healing doesn't just look like I'm out there like working really hard and doing all the things and seeming like life is really great. Healing is also moments of rest and moments of challenge and moments of quiet, right? Like those are also parts of healing. And so when we say that healing is messy and it's not linear, it's because particularly in the society that we live in, we're fed a narrative of healing as a linear path to a particular progression with a particular goal. And that's just not how healing actually works. And spiritual healing, in a very similar way, not a linear path, right? All of those of us from faith traditions know our spiritual growth goes backwards and forwards. It goes through phases, but that doesn't mean that we're not faithful. And so I think that's just a more helpful framework for thinking about healing, because if we're expecting kind of a linear journey, we're always going to be disappointed, because that's not how it actually works. Reverend Ingrid, did you want to add something?
Just would like to say, actually, I just would like to echo Salima's thoughts in saying you can't fix healing. Healing cannot be fixed like you fix a car or a broken wash machine. But sorry, but the waiting time is actually healing time as well. And healing means to wait and to rest. And healing is not something, I don't want to repeat Salima here. But I just would like to tell you that in my own experiences, when I went on medical leave, healing happened because, for example, I didn't do anything for the first 8 days. I just slept. And so I didn't work, I didn't read nothing, but I started the process of healing. Others would say you just slept or you just didn't anything else, you just did nothing, but healing started already. And Anke, let me read to you, or I can send to you this one poem I found from this unknown author, and it really resonates with me. And it says, "It's okay if you thought you were over it, but it hits you all over again. It's okay to fall apart, even you thought you had it under control. You are not weak." And then it comes, healing is messy, and there's no timeline for healing, just patience.
Thank you, Ingrid. Salima and Ingrid, would you say that healing is very much like how we get into mental illness? Mental illness is not you're either mentally ill or you're not. It's a continuum, and we get into it because we're lacking things in our lives. So I would ask that question: is it similar process to get into become mentally ill as to healing? And then the second question would be, when people are mentally ill, they often resist having medication because they think that's going to put them in a category of loony or crazy or stupid, deficient. But my personal experience is that we need all the help we can get, and part of the help is prayer, part of the help is just loving family, part of the help is medication, big part of the help has been mentioned a couple times is just sleep and good food, and reducing stress. So what are your comments on those two observations?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I mentioned really briefly in my comments, but mental health and mental illness are a spectrum. And normally when I talk about this, I have like a slide and it has like a 4-quadrant kind of model. And it has like a line for mental health and a line for mental illness. And so, for example, what that tells us, for example, is that at any given point, everybody falls somewhere on that spectrum. Just like for your physical health, you have your physical wellness and your physical illness levels. That might not be the same. So you can have a chronic physical illness, like me, I have asthma, okay? And you can still be generally quite physically well, right? But I also carry this chronic illness that's just part of my life. And sometimes I'll have flare-ups and it means my illness level will be higher than it is otherwise, but I'm never without that illness. But my general wellness is still pretty good. Mental health actually works in really similar ways. So you can have or not have a particular diagnosis. You might carry that diagnosis your whole life, but you might also still be quite well. Or you might be really mentally unwell and not have a diagnosable illness, right? We see that with physical health as well all the time, where we're just physically unwell, but there isn't anything like diagnosably wrong. Like we don't have a cold, I don't have a flu, I don't have a chronic illness, I'm just not feeling well, right? And so I really like the quadrant model because it really helps to explain how much breadth there is in our experience of health and wellness. And illness. And so healing, of course, has to exist in that spectrum too, of there are different pathways to healing and different interventions and different things that we need depending on where we fall in that spectrum. So if, for example, I'm dealing with an illness, I may or may not need medications. If I'm working through a cold, I might just need some sleep and some soup and just some time. If I'm working through a flu or an infection or something else, I might need medical interventions at a different level. And mental illness works the same way, right? And so the reluctance around medication, I think, is a really real thing. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And people talk about, this sort of stigma of I'm going to be looked at a certain way. I'm going to think of myself in a certain way. But when someone has diabetes, we don't tell them not to take their insulin. And, you know, when I have asthma, mostly my asthma is managed. I don't need my inhalers all the time. But when I have a flare up, I need my inhalers because otherwise I'm going to end up in the hospital. And so mental health works the same way. And that's why it's so important for us to think about health in a holistic way, right? That it is mental health, spiritual health, physical health, social health, all of these pieces that we need for us to be well, and that we need all sorts of things to support that. And sometimes that includes medication, but it always includes things like social contact, meaning and purpose, how we feel cared for and held by our communities. And when those things aren't working well, or when things are harder for us, we might need extras. And that's okay. It's totally fine. And you might need that extra support your whole life. I've had asthma my whole life. I still have inhalers. I still carry them all the time. That's okay. That's just what my body is like. Right. And so we just need to work to getting to a point where we think about mental health in the same kinds of ways, that we allow for people to have that. Right. Like nobody would expect me to walk around without my glasses because I wouldn't be able to see. Right. Why do we expect that of people? And what does that say? So, yeah, totally fair.
Okay. That maybe is a good segue into the question that was asked in the chat. A friend has been ill for a long time. She never reaches out to me, but seems to be grateful when I reach out to her. Is it ever inappropriate to continue pursuing someone and letting them know you still think of them?
Of course, it's appropriate to reach out to someone and to say, I think of you, or even to think of other creative ways. Must not be an email or a text message. Again, I'm quite traditional, but it can be a card, a simple card with the words, I'm thinking of you. If you feel like this, please contact me. If not, it's good. Something, but to make sure to the other person that there's somebody who thinks of you, somebody who does take care, somebody who is concerned about your health. And again, there could be many creative ways to do so, but I would always encourage somebody who tries to be in contact with somebody who is certainly balancing with mental health, to reach out. And this said, I remember when I worked as a hospital chaplain, there are also boundaries set when this other person is able to directly react to your offer, and can say or will say, right now I just need time off. Right now I don't want to be contacted. Right now just give me the space I need. That's fine as well. But people who are really suffering from severe depression, they might not be able to articulate this boundary, but for them to know that there's somebody around would be very helpful. And but I would like to say something to your question as well, Dale. But Salima, would you like to add something?
I would only just add, I agree. And I think letters are lovely because they just sort of arrive as a surprise. I think that's wonderful. The only other thing I add is that sometimes we forget, like when we reach out, we'll say things like, like, let me know if you need anything. And when folks are struggling, it's really hard for them to think about what it is that they need. So when I've been having my worst depressive episodes, particularly when my postpartum depression was really bad, it was very hard for me to articulate what I needed. I just knew I needed help. And I couldn't figure out what to ask for, so I didn't ask. And then I had a friend who was like, I'm going to set up a meal train for you. And for the next month, you're not going to have to think about dinner. And it was miraculous. Like, it was probably the thing that was the most helpful of anything that I did over those few months. And I think that's the other thing that sometimes we forget, is that we can offer like tangible help. Like, can I drop off some food for you? I made some soup and I'm down the street, or I can come and drop it off at your house at this time, and you don't actually need to see me. I just want to drop food off for you. Dale, I see that you have a question.
Along that line, you know, when my nephew committed suicide, my sister sent my sister-in-law skip the dishes coupon.
Yeah.
You know, so $50.
Yeah. Honestly, and that's just like regular stuff. Like my little one like got a burn the other day. He was trying to help in the kitchen and he hurt himself. And so my in-laws were like, okay, we're going to buy you dinner. And they sent us like a credit for food. Right. And it's just, those are the little things. And like, especially right now where we can't do community in the ways that we normally do, those are things that can make a big difference. Like I had friends send me like coupons or Groupons for someone to come clean my house. Right. Like those are the things that like, especially when you're struggling, just you don't get them done. You just can't, right? Like getting food, getting the house clean, like just getting out of bed is hard sometimes. And so I would say tangible help is the other piece that I often recommend.
And I hear you both saying, sorry, Diane, just a second. I hear you both saying that, you know, we can all increase the general mental health and well-being of our world if we just reach out to others and make that contact, you know. And I think that's one of the things that the digital age, you know, we're also busy, and you know, we send an email and then don't get a response and think, well, they don't care. But you know, you got to do an email and a text message and an actual call, and maybe get to their doorstep and knock on the door, you know, somehow just get through to the other persons, let them know that you care and you're there. Go ahead, Diane. Can't hear you, Diane. Something's, doesn't say you're muted, but.
Perhaps write down your question.
Okay, Diane, do you want to type your question in the chat box, or we can't hear you? There is a question in the chat box from both faiths emphasize not losing hope. What happens when we are on the brink of losing hope in our lives? How can we build resilience when our prayers are not answered? Why does God's help always seem to come when we are in a state of despair? That may be three
questions. Can I answer this one?
Sure, go ahead, Jamila.
Thank you. Here's the thing. There's many things to this, because first of all, many times trials come for a reason, right? God does not do anything just because. Sometimes you learn a lesson out of it. Sometimes you grow out of it, right? You grow like as a person. But also there's the other part too, where you say, okay, well, why is there so much suffering in the world? But nobody ever asked themselves, how did I fix it? Right? Like 80% of the world has maybe 20% of the, 80% of the world has only 20% of the resources. And then that other 20% has the 80% of the resources, right? And we see it on TV all the time. We see those starving people, and we see the injustice and the equality. And people will complain, well, why is the world like this and stuff? And it's like, well, what did you do to fix it? Right?
Okay, thank you. Salima?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I do think that there are lots of ways to approach this issue of hope. And I do think, obviously, as you heard me say, I think there's a big part of that we have to be responsible for one another and how those burdens are disproportionately spread. But the other thing that I like to say is, just as much as we think of hope as of healing as not being linear, neither is hope. Right? Like if we look at our traditions, we look at the narratives of the prophets and the messengers, if we look at our faith traditions of saints and sages, doubt, questioning, struggle, that's part of the narrative. It's part of the human process. And so I think moments where we're not sure or moments where we're struggling to find hope are a human thing. And I think the expectation that we should always be absolutely certain is not a realistic one. And I don't think that's what we see in our traditions. When we look at the scriptures, that's not what we see. We see moments of doubt, and we see moments of hopelessness. And I think you heard that in all the stories that we talked about today, Reverend Ingrid and I. And so I think like that's really important to keep in mind. And I think ultimately finding hope again is about asking those questions of what does it mean for me to be here? How can I contribute to this being better? If Allah is not responding to me, where maybe is the answer that I am not listening to, right? Surah Duha is one of the ones that I go back to all the time when I feel like I'm not being answered, because it's literally Allah saying like, I'm still here. I haven't gone anywhere. And it's it's literally this necklace is those first 4 lines of Surah Duha. And because I need it on my body sometimes as a reminder, right? And then I think also we find hope in surprising, unexpected small things. So with my clients, I often encourage them to find, if not moments of hope, then at least small moments of joy, which are remarkably similar to moments of hope. Your first sip of coffee in the morning, how warm your blankets feel when you get into them, that first breath of crisp fall air, those little things. I think that we often miss. Those are the things that anchor us back into the world and into hopefulness. And so when nothing else feels accessible, when everything else feels like it's too much, those are pieces we can still access. And so that's what I turn to as the way to bring me back.
Gratefulness can also play a huge role, actually. Like
Yeah.
it really makes you grateful for what you have. Like I remember one time I had a project going on at the Cross Cancer, and I just, I saw a lot of suffering. And although it was hard to see it at the same time, it kind of made me say, Alhamdulillah, like thank God that I have this health. And I think that plays a huge role as well, is just recognizing what you do have and being grateful for it, because the truth is many people wish for what we have.
Yeah, and thank you. Gratefulness and hope certainly do belong together. I would like to remind you that at least our Christian people, that today is not only Halloween Day but Reformation Day. And that Martin Luther, the one who changed the way of the church really drastically, a former monk, a teacher, professor of theology, somebody who preached with passion, he suffered from depression and he lost hope quite often. But he, what really brought him to continue and to move on was to talk about his struggles and his hopelessness, and to pray with the Psalms. For example, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And other Psalms. So he just didn't pass, or he just didn't prevent himself from being honest to himself, from knowing himself. And he was as vulnerable as any person could be when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or God, where are you? And this finally is hope as well. It is hope to ask this question, my God, where are you? I'm desperate now. Because on the other side, this question gives us the permission to ask. And every time we give ourselves the permission to ask for help, for hope, we are not hopeless.
Yes.
And this other, I quoted some poems today, and one of my most favorite poems is from Emily Dickinson. Perhaps you know this: hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. I like poems, sorry. I just had to quote it.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Salima. I think we're coming to the end of our time. Not sure what it means that hope is a thing with feathers, but we can end on a hopeful note. And I keep hearing from both of you and from the other participants that we can address mental wellness by just engaging with each other and walking with each other in where we're at, accepting where we're at, empathy, and where the other person is at, and affirming them in the midst of that, and walking with them. And I think that's a great counsel for all of us as we face stresses and opportunities of a digital age, and of being connected and not connected, and struggling with COVID.
Dale, can I add something, please?
Sure.
Salima, I would like to thank you very much for the vulnerability you showed today and the honesty. It was a privilege to work with you. We didn't work in breakout rooms. We didn't attend breakout rooms. We didn't join breakout rooms. But it was just a privilege to work together and to learn so much from you. So I thank you from my heart for.
Likewise, It was such a privilege, and honest, it's just such an honor, and such really beautiful thoughts to share. And I'm also a big fan of poetry, so I really appreciated that today.
Thank you.
Okay, God bless.